Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sanctum YouTube channel. Today, we're going to be doing another AFL preview, and we're talking about the Gold Coast Suns. And I thought to talk about Gold Coast, who are a pristine AFL football club, they're about to embark on their 13th season, I think now, 12th season. And I've got two very special guests with me. I've got Lachlan Dan and Scott Curtis. How are you, Scotty?
Very well. Looking forward to it.
I'm very well. That's good to hear. Lachlan, Dan, it's good to have you on, mate. Your first preview, isn't it?
It is. I'm very excited. Gold Coast had a good year last year, so yeah, hopefully more for the Suns.
We've got a lot of energy at the moment because we are talking about Gold Coast, and they are bringing a lot of sunshine to 2023, I reckon. Scotty, what's your thoughts on Gold Coast? Your initial thoughts coming into the year? How are you feeling about them?
Well, I reckon this is almost the year. Like they've been sort of humming and ahhing, knocking on the door, back down, back up a little bit, but they sort of had the nucleus sort of sign and commit, and they looked pretty good last year. They sort of dropped off towards the end, but they weren't too far away from the 8. So if I was a Suns fan, everyone's second team, but I'd be hoping that they can sort of be pushing for the top 8 this year. That should be their expectations for sure.
Dan, how are you feeling now of the Suns coming into this year? Stewie Jews obviously primed them in a way where last year was a go and get it an almost year, but this year could be the one.
Yeah, well, they had as you said, a really good start to last year and faded off towards the back end of the year, and that can sort of happen, particularly when you have a young side, and when they got to do a lot of interstate trips as well. Obviously, every second week it doesn't help. But they recruited quite well. Got a little bit of experience. Ben Long is one name from St Kilda that came across who'll be hoping to play a bit of a role there. So, they're an exciting side to watch. Well, they were last year, indeed. It was probably one of, if not the best year they had last year in their short existence. And, yeah, I think there's no reason they can't build on that.
Yes, Scotty, I think Lachlan did mention that Ben Long, probably the key recruit of all the ones that came in. I'm looking at the ins and outs. They had Jed Anderson, who was originally from North Melbourne, come in as a supplemental selection pick. Tom Berry from Brisbane has come through, the brother of Jared. So, and then obviously draft picks as well, which we'll get into. But do you think they could have recruited a bit more?
Look, I think to be honest, they've got that many sort of early 20s guys and even a bit younger that, I mean, they were happy to throw away pick 7 to Geelong because they didn't feel they needed that. So I think they were pretty keen on Tom Berry from the start. They were pretty quick to snap him up from Brisbane. He wasn't quite getting the game, but I think it's more about just utilising what's there and hoping that you get the natural improvement from those guys.
Dan, I think a few outs, obviously, with Jack Bose going to Geelong, and the big one going to your club, the Adelaide Crows, Isaac Rankin. Is he going to be a big miss? I know coming from you, and your opinion is going to be yes, absolutely massive, because the Crows have got a big recruit, big name. But do you think he'll be missed at Gold Coast?
Yes and no. Yes, because he's a very a live wire up forward, and he can produce skills that not a lot of forwards that up there can. But in terms of a Gold Coast perspective, you got to look at it at sort of who's the next man up, and you've got players like Eli Hollands burst onto the scene in the last month of the year. I believe got a Rising Star nomination in one of those games. He was a top 10 pick at least 2020 draft, and also one of the kids they recruited, Bailey Humphrey, was I believe a top 10 pick, which was part of the rank and trade. Can play half forward, midfield. So obviously that will leave a gaping hole, but there's plenty of players that can step up and fill the void.
Yeah, I think so. And Scotty, I think the one thing they did do well in terms of their drafting was it wasn't so much the main draft, it was the pre-season draft. Like they've got Connor Blakely, who's obviously from Fremantle as a rookie. They picked up Brodie McLaughlin as well, who's another supplemental pick. Jake Stein was in the rookie draft. Bailey Humphrey, as Dan said, was pick 6, so the massive pick. Yeah. And they traded quite aggressively to get those players, not so much in, but they traded aggressively to keep some revenue going for future years as well. How did you find their draft?
Yeah, like I said, I think they're more than happy with sort of what they've got. Get a couple of youngsters in, a bit of senior bodies to sort of help them out. I think they were not. I don't think they're that keen to chase the big names. I think they're more like trying to keep the money to. I think they're going to have to overpay a couple of them just to try and keep them to stay, which is sort of the nature of what's happening up there. So just relying on their natural progression and guys actually wanting to stay around the club. I think that's their sort of aim from here on in for a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. I think they've had a pretty good, successful pre-season. And we talk about off-season news. They've had a pretty quiet pre-season. But the one big thing, I think you talk about trying to keep that money to keep a lot of players to stay. Obviously, Lukosha signed last year, but Noah Anderson signing on, I think it was a 4-year deal. Dan, I think that's a massive win to Gold Coast and a lot of confidence in probably the younger playing group as well to say, hey, this is a future leader. This is a bloke that's going to take us to where we want to go. And he signed on.
Yeah, and I think that was one of the big reasons they recruited him, along with his best mate, Matt Rao. They looked at both of those kids in the draft, and obviously they're both very good players, which was obviously a reason they got picked in the top, or both the top 5 picks. Might have even been top 3 picks that Gold Coast had in that particular draft. And yeah, it's paying dividends for them. And as you said, they've got a really young list. A few of them already mentioned with Hollands and Humphrey as well. Obviously, can't get any newer than straight out of the draft. And there's a couple of other ones floating around, and one I'll get to in Ben King, who I'm very excited for the return of as well. So if they can sort of start to build a young culture of, hey, we're building something here, let's all stick together, they can become a team that you really don't want to verse. And maybe in the past it's always been, we've got Gold Coast this week, you sort of almost straight away bank it as a win, whereas nowadays you might go, oh, Gold Coast away, like no one wants that sort of thing.
Yeah, definitely. I think Scotty as well, that name that Dan just mentioned, Ben King, if he comes back, it gives him another option, it gives him their main option, and he's probably most crucial to them. He might not be there early on in the year, which, given he's young, take his time with this ACL recovery and get him 100% right. But if he's there come around 7, 8, 9, going into the bye, coming out of it, and they're in a decent position, that's almost two guaranteed wins right there.
That's it. And they had they sort of stopgap with Levi Casbolt last year, and he was certainly serviceable. And I think Mabu Choi did a lot better than they actually thought. I reckon a lot of us thought. So I think he was really good last year. So they'll have the stopgap again. I think Levi's still running around. Surely he'll go forever. But yeah, just having someone when Ben King comes back and with Choi up there as well, I think, or Chol, sorry. I say Choi. Chol. That's a pretty good double-pronged attack going forward for sure.
Yeah, definitely. Obviously, Will Powell, who's a young defender, is going to miss 6 weeks with a hamstring injury that he's occurred, but they still have a lot of depth. But other than that, they've had a pretty good pre-season. Tony Cochran, obviously, just a bit of off-season and off-field news, obviously resigned. Who's been a key figure. I like to call him the Gold Coast Koshy because they look really identical. And they sort of have the similar attitude. They're big businessmen and like to go about things in a certain way. So I think whilst having a big impact to get Gold Coast up and running, him resigning, so it probably opens the door for a fresh start as well for Gold Coast, Dan.
Yeah, and you know Koshy pretty well more than anyone. And as you said, Tony's a similar sort of character. And now that you mention it, I do really see the comparison. But they've both done very well in turning around those football clubs since they joined. Gold Coast were a basket case for a long time. And now they're really competitive and are banging down the door of finals. And sometimes off-field stuff can impact you. Sometimes it can't. That one I wouldn't have thought would impact them too much in terms of they start churning out bad results. But they'd probably want that sorted sooner rather than later. But there should be a few strong candidates floating around. There's
always a candidate. If there's an AFL personnel somewhere around, he's a candidate. She's a candidate. They're a candidate. There's candidates everywhere for that job. So I wouldn't be surprised who they pick up. But it's very exciting stuff for Gold Coast. And I think the one thing before we get into the questionnaire, lads, is I think it probably describes it perfectly for Gold Coast is if one team slips up that's from the top 8, Gold Coast are in. I think that's if they perform to their level and their expectation, and one team slips up, besides Port Adelaide, obviously, they'll slip in. But we'll get into the questionnaire, and we'll go by question number 1. We'll start with you, Scotty. How did you judge Gold Coast's pre-season overall?
Yeah, well, like I said, no news is good news aside from the off-field resignation. Then, yeah, if you don't hear about them, I reckon that's always good news for sure.
Yeah, definitely. Dan, how did you feel about Gold Coast's off-season in general?
I have been doing a little bit of reading before the video. But there's apparently a lot of players in really strong form. Places in the best 22 are at a premium. So if you start performing start performing poorly at the top level, there'll be someone taking your spot. And we touched on it a little bit, but there's a few players with strong leadership potential, and maybe none more than Noah Anderson. So, yeah, as you said, no news is good news, but yeah, they'll keep flying under the radar, and I'm sure they're happy to keep doing that.
They'll fly over the radar because they're up in Gold Coast. But we'll get into Fantasy Supercoach. Who's your pick, Dan? Who are you feeling should be in your team from Gold Coast this year?
No questions asked. He's actually my first pick every year. Tuke Miller, every single year. Cannot go wrong. Tackle it. Absolute workhorse. They try and tag him. You can't tag him. He'll tackle. He'll run all day. He's beast. So, yeah, number 1 every year.
Yeah, I agree. I saw him play live second last round of last year up there. He just runs like anything. Absolute machine. So first pick for me too.
I heard rumours. I don't know if this is true. They call him the treadmill because he just keeps going. So
sounds right.
We'll go in.
It's a good nickname.
They call him. Yeah, I know. And I just made it up too. There's no rumour.
Sounds good.
It's me in my head.
we'll call him that from now on.
Yeah, I'm something the Sanctum. Hashtag treadmill.
Good Miller.
Treadmill Miller. That's shocking. What's one change that needs to be made? What's one change that needs to be made, Scotty, for Gold Coast this year?
Look, I think like we said, there's a lot of youngsters, particularly in the midfield. I think a lot of their defenders I think they're probably just one bigger key back. They've got Sammy Collins who just tries hard. I reckon they're just like an elite sort of back. So I don't know if a couple of their younger ones can sort of step up and play that role. But I reckon the real big, huge forwards often get a hold of them. So that's where I think they'd be looking.
Dan, what are you most excited for Gold Coast this year?
The return of Ben King. I think this bloke is an absolute star. When he was drafted, he can play both ends of the ground, as they said, but he's turned into pretty well their main key forward, and he can make his career as one of the best key forwards in the comp if he can keep progressing. So I'm very excited to see him back. I was absolutely devastated when I saw he went down last pre-season, so I'm excited for him to be back.
Lovely. Scotty, it's a big year for?
I would say Mr. Lukosius. So, I think like when he came onto the scene and he's elite kicking, and you think, well, this guy could do anything. And I just reckon he went backwards a bit last year across halfback. You didn't notice him as much. And I think from a few games I was watching, he was missing a few targets. So I reckon they're looking for him to step up again to that next level and beyond for sure.
Yeah, definitely. I agree with that completely. And probably a smoky if he gets it right for 22 games, a smoky for all Australians. So I like that. Who's ready for a breakout year, Lockie?
Elijah Hollands. I did touch on it slightly earlier. But yeah, as I said, showed really strong signs at the back end of last year. Former top 10 pick. He's ready to go, and he can make life very, very difficult for opposition sides.
Tell you what, we're only 6 questions into this questionnaire and a little bit of news and conversation, but I'm very excited for Gold Coast. I don't know what it is.
That's it.
It might be my second team this year, but what I'm also excited for is this. This is my favourite question of the questionnaire. Is a headline you'll see. Scotty knows all about it. Dan, I'm going to start with you. What's a headline that I'll see about the Gold Coast Suns this year?
Gold Coast gets second ever Brownlow medalist as Miller brings home Charlie. Not sure it fits on the front page of the Herald Sun, but
Yeah, it would be. Yeah.
Yeah, I've seen bigger headlines.
that was what you will see.
Oh, there's wordplay in there with took. Miller took Brownlow home or something like that. Scotty, what's yours?
I think if this, I haven't got one headline, but as long as there's no headlines about people wanting to leave, I think that's the thing they need to avoid. Yeah. So if there's no headlines about it and someone else wanting to go home, even though they've signed contracts, I think that's the no headline is the headline they're really after.
I really like that. You flip that question and go, no headlines.
That's it.
It's the best way to put it.
Sorry?
I like that. Mine would be finals berth is due. So
that's good.
And throw a treadmill in there somewhere as well.
Thank you. I thought of that on the spot too. Kind of like treadmill. All right, what's one game that is a must watch on the calendar this year, Scotty? Gold Coast.
I think whoever they play in round one. You know, I probably should have looked it up before we did this.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Hang on.
You've got it here.
Swannies,
huge. I assume it's up there because they always seem to get a home game first up. Yeah, that's massive against the grand finalists. If they can get off for a win against that round one, up and going.
Dan, what's yours?
Well, it's actually a very similar prediction to Scott, and it's actually his mob in round three at Metricon Stadium.
I didn't want to talk about Geelong, that's all.
There is no better way than to make a statement than beat last year's grand finalists on your home deck in the first month of footy. So they copped a bit of a pasting there last year, as we all pretty well did by Geelong. But yeah, they'll be keen for a response, and I'm very excited for that game. I believe it's a Saturday night game, so Saturday night footy, round three. There you go.
It is, yes. And just to I'll top it off. The Isaac Rankin Cup in round 6 up at Metricon. Gold Coast versus Adelaide. That's the one.
Right.
Because you know what? Gold Coast will win it.
Yes.
But that's nothing. I had to throw that in there. What is a minimum expectation for Gold Coast this year, Scott?
As we said it before, top 8, I reckon. I reckon that if they're not aiming for that, what's the point?
Yeah. I think Dan will both agree with that one as well. Yep, 100%. And where will they finish on the ladder this year, Dan?
11th, only because it's not necessarily a bad 11th place. I just think there's just 10 teams better. Like sometimes when you finish 11th, you have a bad year, but I think they'll have a good year. They'll just, not quite yet.
Okay. Scotty, yours?
Well, around the mark. I think they won 10 games last year. So if they're pushing more than that, 11 to 12, they're knocking on the door. I think they'll sort of finish 9th, let's say. Yeah. Maybe the percentage will kill them. They'll get flogged a couple of times, but yeah, I'm hoping they finish 8th. It would be great to see them in a final.
Yeah, the big thing is, and I agree, I think they'll finish 9th. I've got them placed 9th. The big thing for Gold Coast is a good start, but also avoiding those games that you know they probably get pumped in. There's always games at Marble they play where they lose by 5 or 6 goals. I think there's games. Travelling west is always their Achilles heel. They'll get smashed by 10, 11 goals. Do they play Geelong in Geelong this year?
I don't know. To be honest, if they do, then yeah, watch out. But
you've still got a premiership hangover, it seems, because I remember that one.
I don't believe they love coming to our state either, Ant. Don't know if they've got too many wins at Adelaide Oval.
They haven't beaten Port at the Adelaide Oval.
Yes, they did.
Neither
mate.
us. So,
their first year they beat you, mate. Sorry to say.
That was at Amy Stadium. It doesn't count.
They still beat you in Adelaide. But yeah, sure.
Shut up. All right. Well, that's Gold Coast. We're done and dusted. Lachlan and Scott, thank you very much for joining me on this preview.
My pleasure. Cheers.
All right. We'll look forward to seeing you very, very soon on the Inner Sanctum YouTube channel. Plenty more AFL previews to look at. There's a whole playlist worth for 2023. So make sure you check out your team and subscribe to the channel for more content to come your way across 2023. We'll see you next time.